Hello, I'm Dr. Tara Palmatier of shrinkformen.com. In today's video, I'll be discussing what a narcissist or borderline means when they use the expression unconditional love. If you are or have been in a relationship with a borderline narcissist or a psychopath, at some point you've undoubtedly been told, perhaps ad nauseum, you need to love me unconditionally. I expect unconditional love from you. If you're like many of the men and women I work with, you probably grit your teeth and roll your eyes upon hearing the term unconditional love. But why? What's wrong with love, much less unconditional love? That sounds like a reasonable request from a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, family member, or friend, right? Wrong. It's neither a reasonable request nor a reasonable demand. First, we need to address how we define unconditional love and whether or not the unconditional love is reciprocal. Typically, it isn't with a disordered person. If you've been in an abusive relationship with a woman or man who has narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, or psychopathic traits, you know firsthand the breathtaking degree of entitlement, hypocrisy, and double standards by which these individuals operate on a daily basis. What does unconditional love usually mean in relationship to a narcissist, borderline, or other abusive personality? It means that you don't hold the narcissist, borderline, histrionic, or psychopath accountable for their bad behavior, nor do you enforce appropriate boundaries and natural consequences for their abusive behavior. Basically, these individuals have confused unconditional love with you happily and obliviously tolerating their abuse of you and others, and that includes their own children. In fact, the mental health field has developed a term for tolerating the abuse of a personality disordered individual. It's called radical acceptance. I've worked with many couples counseling refugees who have been sold this bill of goods. Specifically, spouses, typically husbands and boyfriends, are told by the couples therapist that, one, their girlfriend's or wife's behavior, here's a big warning sign that you might not be working with a therapist who can help you, is that they will, when describing abusive behavior perpetrated by a woman, they won't use the term abuse. They just call it behavior. That your girlfriend's or wife's behavior is just a manifestation of her anxiety, childhood wounds, or that your wife or girlfriend is testing your love for her. All of that may well be true, but it certainly doesn't make it okay or acceptable. Two, that the boyfriend or husband mustn't take the behavior, what most people would call abuse, personally, nor must he have an appropriate emotional response to it, like anger or pain, but rather be patient and loving in the face of their wife's or girlfriend's ongoing abuse. Now, of course, this happens to female patients, female counseling patients who are the target of an abusive narcissist or borderline. But in my experience, it's much more common for therapists to adopt this attitude toward male abuse victims who are being abused by a woman. Now, if you have experienced this in couples counseling or currently are experiencing it, I strongly encourage you to find another therapist. I can't stress this strongly enough. Therapists who advocate this form of radical acceptance are advocating abuse, plain and simple. As I mentioned, this can happen to women who are the targets of a disordered male abuser, particularly if the boyfriend or husband has been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. There are some therapists who are BPD apologists and enablers regardless of gender. In my experience, though, most therapists don't encourage radical acceptance to women who are being abused by male partners. Although I have worked with clients in lesbian relationships who have been encouraged to do so. So figure that one out. Generally speaking, the mental health field has a difficult time admitting that women can be abusers even when their victims are other women and children. Many wives and girlfriends of men with abusive exes and adult children of narcissistic and borderline mothers understand this all too well. They've lived with it, in the case of the children, all of their lives. And I work with many women who have married a man with an abusive ex who's still causing mischief. Now, if you're a man who thinks you might be working with this type of couples therapist, or individual therapist for that matter, ask the therapist what they would advise your wife or girlfriend if she were treating you, or excuse me, if you were treating her like she treats you. And I've had clients who have done this, and typically they get a lot of double talking and sidestepping and defensiveness. Who told you to ask that? Who else have you been talking to? What have you been reading? And why do they do that? Most likely because they won't admit that they'd tell a woman to run for the nearest exit and get the heck away from a man who is treating her like you've been treated. Now, if for whatever reason you're committed to staying with your abuser, for example, there are minor children, or you're still confusing abuse with love due to your own childhood issues, then yes, you do need to accept that your abuser is unlikely to change in any meaningful way, that she or he is severely limited as a human being, and at some point after she or he has completely depleted your resources, you may be further vilified and discarded for fresh supply. You don't get points for being a compliant martyr at the end of the relationship. You get blamed for being broken. Never mind the fact that it's the abuser who broke you with your consent, that is if you see your abuser for who she or he is. In which case, please consider finding an individual therapist for your own individual support to understand why you've chosen this kind of relationship and what keeps you in it. Furthermore, if the therapist who's advocating radical acceptance isn't holding your abuser accountable and addressing those behaviors, they're enabling the problem. Having a personality disorder is not a license to abuse without consequence, despite what many diagnosed personality disordered individuals, therapists, and BPD experts will tell you. As you can see, the concepts of unconditional love and radical acceptance are frequently abused in couples therapy and individual therapy to persuade targets of narcissistic, borderline, or psychopathic abuse, particularly if the abuser is a female who has emotional problems, that you're an unloving and abusive partner if you don't unconditionally accept your partner's abuse. If that last sentence makes your head spin, good. It should, because it's ridiculous. It also probably echoes what your narcissist or borderline has been drilling into your head, which is equally ridiculous. In the context of adult relationships, unconditional love isn't a reasonable expectation. Unconditional love is for children and animals, and even then, there are limits. For example, an aggressive dog who bites humans and other animals when there is no threat to the dog probably doesn't make a good pet. When a child misbehaves or does something dangerous, do you smile at the child and tell them how much you love them? Or do you explain why the behavior is wrong or unsafe and deliver a consequence? Yes, you still love the child, but you don't radically accept or tolerate the behavior. Hopefully, if your parenting is consistent and loving and you're dealing with a child who doesn't have severe psychological issues, the child will grow and mature into a functioning, reasonable adult. There are many problems when applying unconditional love to disordered, abusive adult partners. First, disordered abusers typically split, meaning they view the world and people in black and white. They love you or they hate you. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to both love you and feel angry with or hurt or disappointed by you at the same time. It seems to work like this. If I feel good and you're giving me everything I want and making me feel good about me, you are good and I love you. If I'm feeling bad, might not even have anything to do with you, or don't give me what I want, or make me feel, or you make me feel bad about me, even by pointing out when I've done something hurtful to you, then you are bad. In many ways, this is the way a toddler views the world in relationships. And it's often an insurmountable problem in a relationship with an adult who reasons and feels this way. Abusers typically live on a one-way street paved with double standards. In other words, they can be great big hypocrites who live by one set of rules for themselves and another set of rules for everyone else. It's different when I do it defense. Does your narcissistic or borderline abuser typically offer you unconditional love and acceptance when you screw up? And I mean when you screw up in external objective reality, not their internal subjective reality. Or are you met with extreme attacks, criticism, shaming, guilt trips, or physical violence? There can be no healthy conflict resolution without personal accountability, remorse, and redress. Because the narcissist, borderline, and psychopath often experiences healthy and appropriate boundaries as being controlled, and personal accountability and natural consequences for their behaviors as abusive, well, the problem should be quite evident. There's rarely conflict resolution with these individuals, only capitulation, appeasement, and pretending like there's not a giant elephant in the middle of the parlor. Instead of successfully addressing and resolving grievances and hurts, they multiply and eventually breed resentment and contempt in both parties. Furthermore, if your abuser won't admit fault and doesn't feel remorse, she or he will likely continue to engage in the hurtful behaviors. Unlike a child, you can't put an adult who acts out and lashes out into a timeout. If you take away her car or credit card, she can accuse you of domestic violence. Also, unlike children, your abuser is, and I wasn't recommending doing those things, but people typically don't change unless there's a consequence for not changing. Also, unlike children, your abuser is unlikely to grow out of this way of thinking and being. One of the Shrink for Men moderators recently shared a quote from Ian Fleming's Goldfinger that's a helpful gauge in considering unconditional love, limits to love, forgiveness, and boundaries. Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, the third time it's enemy action. There are other variations of this attributed to earlier sources that are more relational in case enemy action seems too extreme, such as once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, three times is a habit, or once is nothing, twice is coincidence, three times is a moral certainty. Please consider committing whichever version is more palatable to you to memory and see if living by it yields better relationships and relationship partners. And most importantly, there are limits to adult love relationships, and abusers don't respect the limits of others. Physical violence is a limit, or rather it should be. Most women understand that if a man hits them or physically assaults them in some way, it's time to pull the ripcord. I wish more men understood this and never cease to be amazed by the number of men who disclose serious physical assaults by their wives or girlfriends as if it's not a big thing. It's a very big thing. Gentlemen, if a woman engages in physical violence towards you, in addition to being wrong and abusive, it's only a matter of time before there's police involvement. Guess who's more likely to be arrested, even if you're the one bruised and bleeding? Chronic dishonesty and cruelty should also be limits in a relationship. Most children behave badly because they don't know better or they're attention seeking. Abusive adults know better, but simply don't care or don't care enough to stop, especially if behaving badly gets them what they want in the short term. Even if they claim not to know better, it's dubious. Narcissists and borderlines are all too quick to point the finger when they believe they're being treated unfairly or being victimized. Remember, they usually live on a one-way street paved with double standards. Also, if the narcissist doesn't treat their friends, colleagues, fellow church members, and such the way they treat you, they do know better, and they know that they can get away with treating you that way. The only thing that tolerating or accepting abuse will get you is more abuse. You can call that unconditional love, but it sure sounds more like codependence, and an extremely unhealthy codependence at that. Well, that concludes today's video. You can find more articles by me on shrinkformen.com and crazybusters.com. In addition to articles and a support forum, I also offer individual counseling and coaching services, and you can contact me at shrinkformen, that's the number 4, at gmail.com. Thanks, and I guess subscribe to my channel. And that's it. Bye.